Hi, I'm Max Keiser. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I told you about this book, Currency Wars. Have you read it? If you haven't read it, then you're woefully misinformed about what's going on in the global economy. We welcome back to the show the author, James Rickards. Jim, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max. Thanks for having me.
All right, Jim Rickards, you have tweeted, and I quote your tweet, "If the BRICS countries start the bank as planned, will the BRICS currency be far behind? Geithner is out to trash the U.S. dollar. He's getting his wish." So, Jim Rickards, will a BRICS currency be far behind, and will this be a factor?
I think it will be a factor, Max. There's a lot going on. This is a good example of, be careful what you wish for. Obama, Bernanke, and Geithner set out in early 2010 to take the dollar down by some large amount, 20, 25%. They haven't specified it, but that's clearly their goal, ostensibly to promote U.S. exports. They've also used financial warfare against Iran. We know what happened there. They tanked the Iranian currency, drove interest rates up to 20%, injected hyperinflation into the Iranian economy, and now the BRICS have just had their summit. So what's going on? These U.S. weapons have been effective, but we're beginning to get some pushback where countries, particularly Central Asian countries and South Asian countries, are saying, you know what, we don't want to participate in the dollar system anymore. It wouldn't surprise me in the next couple of years to see, for example, Russia, China, India, Iran, perhaps Malaysia, other Central Asian republics form their own payment system. We kicked Iran out of SWIFT. Well, that's a good hardball tactic if you want to punish Iran, but Iranian oil is too important. They'll just start their own payment system. The BRICS are talking about starting a bank. They actually agreed to explore that. They haven't actually started yet, but they're getting closer to that. These are all straws in the wind. All these countries around the world want to get out of the dollar system because we've abused it. We haven't held up our end of the deal. Our end of the deal is a sound dollar, and we've just trashed the dollar, so they're saying, the heck with it, we'll do something else.
All right, Jim, I mentioned something in the first half of the show. I wanted to get your take on it. I said that after World War II, the U.S. got away with being the world's reserve currency to a large extent because it provided military assistance to countries around the world. It was the world's policeman to some degree. But now you've got countries like India saying that we object to what America's foreign policy is. We don't like what America's doing with their foreign policy. Is that part of this trend that the U.S., that the rest of the world is now rejecting this Washington consensus?
Well, that's part of it, Max, and you're right about the U.S. position at the end of World War II. We were an economic hegemonic power and a military hegemonic power, but there were two elements to that. One was the one you mentioned, which is our superior military force. We extended that umbrella, the nuclear umbrella, over Europe and Japan, so we could kind of get them to do what we wanted because we were holding up their defense. But also remember, in 1950, the United States had 20,000 tons of gold. We had all the gold, 2/3 of all the official gold in the world. Today, of course, that number is down to 8,000 tons. We've lost 12,000 tons. Actually, that was all lost between 1950 and 1980. So we had two things. We had the military and we had the gold. Today we have a lot less gold, although fortunately the U.S. still has a fair amount. Our military is still the strongest in the world, but you're right. Other countries are not necessarily enemies, but they're saying we don't want to participate in this Washington consensus system if it means a cheap dollar, a cheesy dollar, and promoting U.S. exports at the expense of growth in the emerging markets.
Okay, so for those who may not know the book Currency Wars, basically what you've got here is a narrative where you have three distinct currency wars. We are in now, at this time, currency war number 3, which began approximately with the financial crisis of 2000 and 2007 and 2008, when suddenly you've got mayhem in the world. You've had one major battle, as you depict it, with China being on the short end of the stick with the last quantitative easing, where the central bank in the U.S. was able to debase the Chinese currency. No, I got that wrong. They were able to debase the... tell us about that incident.
Well, you're actually right, Max. The Fed was able to debase the Chinese currency, and here's how they did it. They printed so many dollars that those dollars found their way to China in the form of purchases of Chinese goods, so that was the Chinese trade surplus, and also hot money inflows investing into China. China, for its part, was determined to maintain a peg between the dollar and the yuan. That meant the more that we printed and sent over there, they had to print more to soak up the dollars. They were buying dollars from their own exporters and stashing them away in sovereign wealth funds in the central central bank, but they had to print their own currency to do it. That caused inflation in China. So actually, we did debase their currency. They sort of outsourced their monetary policy to the Fed, and that's what they got in return. At some point, the Chinese became spooked by inflation. Inflation is highly destabilizing in China, so they said, all right, we have to do something about it. So they did allow the yuan to appreciate slightly. But what happened next was fascinating. That's why I say the Fed won the first round. But what happened next was really interesting. Chinese growth, net exports, and inflation came down very rapidly. I would have thought it might have taken 18 months to play out. It played out in about 6 months. So now we're back to a peg, at a different level, but they've repegged to the dollar. Well, guess what? That's going to mean another round of quantitative easing because the Fed's not done. They're saying, hey, you want to stop appreciating your currency? Here come the dollars. We'll print more and do it to you again. That's what the currency wars are all about.
Okay, so a lot of people, when they hear quantitative easing, they think it's a net benefit to the price of gold. And we see that it has other ramifications and other dynamics involved here. So let's walk us through what happens, another quantitative easing round, another chapter in the currency wars. What happens to the price of gold? And will this new BRIC currency, if it does materialize, will there be a gold component?
There may very well be, Max. We know the Chinese are buying gold as fast as they can. The Russian central bank has been buying gold consistently for the last 4 years. It may be a gold component, it may be a commodity component, depending on who's in the mix. Certainly Iranian oil. I mean, the largest oil exporter in the world is Russia. So if you ever combined Iranian exports and Russian exports and use that to back up the value of the currency, that would be very powerful. There are a lot of scenarios. As you know, we talk about some of these in the book where we did that war game for the Pentagon. It was a financial war game where countries were trying to gain power against each other using financial weapons, and we described this. There are many ways it could play out, but what's interesting is that it's developing. By the way, I don't think this is going to happen tomorrow or even next year, but looking out 2-3 years, whether it's a BRIC currency or I think even more likely the SDR, everyone knows the Fed has a printing press and can print dollars. But fewer people realize that the IMF has a printing press. They can print these so-called special drawing rights, or the SDRs. They can flood the zone with money. So, this game isn't over yet. Of course, it will end badly. I don't think there's any question about that. But don't underestimate the ability of the U.S. and the IMF and the Europeans and others just to keep these balls in the air by printing money. And that's what we're seeing in the housing market and the stock market today.
All right, Jim. A few months ago, you were pretty aggressive with your prognostication of some kind of Iranian-Israeli conflict. And since then, we've had a price of oil reflecting the sanctions. We've had the situation now where the SWIFT money system has been cut off from Iran, et cetera. So there's been some other developments. Where do you stand now with your thoughts on that?
Well, I haven't really changed very much, Max. You're right about these developments, but we sort of gave it our best shot. And when you kick Iran out of SWIFT, that's not sanctioning a bank or sanctioning some revolutionary guard corps general. That's saying, Iran, you are out of the global payment system. You can't pay your bills. You can't take money in for oil unless you go around, which they're doing, by the way, and setting up bilateral transfer mechanisms with other countries. For example, one of the things they can do, Iran can make an arrangement with Venezia Bank, VTB in Russia, right, or a Chinese bank or banks anywhere around the world, and basically, and there's evidence that they've done this, give them billions of dollars, and then let that bank, in effect, be a front man to the rest of the world. So you see dollars coming in and out of, VTB or some Chinese bank, and it looks legitimate, but behind that, there are separate bilateral transfers between, say, China and Iran or Russia and Iran. So our sanctions haven't really worked. We've given it our best shot. Diplomacy hasn't worked. Sanctions haven't worked. Sabotage, assassination, a lot of things blowing up in Iran. There's a lot going on. Cyber warfare. Looks like the Israelis have launched another round of the Stuxnet virus or some variation on that. So I still expect something like that, perhaps by the summer.
Now, if I read the book correctly, the one point that you identify as really the soft underbelly in all of this would be if China dumps U.S. Treasury bonds. They've got over $1 trillion, and if you add in the agency debt, the Fannie Mae and the Freddie Mac, you point out it could be a lot more. And this is kind of their nuclear option. If they go to market and they dump those securities, it would crash the dollar, and this would cause, obviously, tremendous mayhem. Now, if China follows through, is there a connection there? How are they motivated to do so? Do we enter the fog of currency war, where people start making decisions, after the first currency shot is fired, where it just goes into chaos, which I think is also one of your prognostications as one of the 4 possible outcomes is outright chaos, correct, Jim?
I think that's a very good way to put it, Max. There is a fog of war, whether it's a shooting war, a clandestine war, or a financial war, a currency war. You're always going to get unexpected consequences. But just on that Chinese point, I talk about the scenario of the Chinese dumping their U.S. government debt and raising interest rates and sinking our economy only to set the stage, and only because everyone else talks about it. I actually don't think it's a threat for two reasons. Number one, the minute they tried to do that, the president, with one phone call to the Fed, could freeze their accounts in place. All these treasury bills, they're not paper, they're not physical, they're electronic book entries on the Fed wire system. The Fed is the keeper of that system along with the Treasury. The minute they tried to dump them, we could freeze their accounts with an executive order. You don't need any legislation from Congress. They would be locked in place, and we could say, hey, Chinese, we're not stealing your money, we're just putting it in escrow for a while. We'll get back to you in terms of when you can use it. So we can freeze the whole $3 trillion. They can't dump it. In fact, actually, Treasuries would rally because we'd take that off the market. There'd be a shortage of supply. The other thing is they're completely vulnerable to us. The idea that they have us over barrel, in my view, is nonsense, because we could say, hey, we owe you $3 trillion, print it up, here you go, here's your $3 trillion, good luck buying a loaf of bread. So we can either inflate the currency or freeze the bonds. By the way, the Chinese are completely vulnerable to us because we play rough in the financial warfare space. Now, what the Chinese are doing, Chinese aren't dumb, they understand what I just said, so they're out buying gold, left and right, stripping their gold mines, buying African gold mines, sending out their army and their intelligence services to acquire gold through agents. It's all very bullish for gold at the end of the day.
I just wanted to turn now to domestic issues. You were recently in testifying before the Senate Banking, Housing and Urban Affairs Subcommittee, talking about financial repression and how the Fed's policies are causing a lot of pain and suffering out there. We only have about 30 seconds, as I mentioned. If you can just go through that for us, that'd be great.
Sure, I'll do that quickly. By the way, anyone who wants to read the full testimony is on my website, currencywarsbook.com, so you can go there and find the full written testimony. And the video, if you want to watch it, is at the Senate Banking Committee website, so you can find it there. But just to summarize what I said, we are witnessing the greatest theft in the history of the world. $400 billion per year is being taken from the pockets of savers and handed over to the banks through the Fed's zero interest rate policy. Everyone likes low rates because mortgage rates are low and it juices the stock market. But what about people who actually save and try to do the right thing, put their money in the bank? They're getting zero, instead of a more normalized interest rate of even 1 or 2%. And so that money's being stolen from them, handed over to the banks in the form of zero cost of funds. So as I say, this is 10 times worse than Madoff, and the Treasury is behind it.
All right, that was very succinct, and people can get the details on your website. But we're out of time. Jim Rickards, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. And I want to thank Jim Rickards, Senior Managing Director at Tangent Capital and author of this book, Currency Wars. If you'd like to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.